Today I'm going to talk to you about Campbell's paper entitled Sense, Reference, and Selective Attention. Note that the PDF for this paper that you download is very long. It's about 50 pages, but that's actually not the entire length. That's not the length of the paper, because in the PDF there is a second paper which is a response to Campbell's paper, which is not a required reading. So hopefully that didn't confuse you, and the paper by Campbell is only about 25 pages, I think. In any case, I'm going to be telling you today about Campbell's work in that paper, which is his way of refining the notion of neo-Fregean sense in light of the work of Evans, which we talked about last week, as well as in light of Campbell's earlier paper, which we talked about previously as well. So in this video, I'm going to give you an overview of the lecture, and then we're going to review some of the ideas from Evans and the previous paper by Campbell. So here is an overview of the content of this lecture. So by focusing on perceptual demonstratives, so these are words like this and that, which are when they're used to talk about perceptually available objects. So perceptual demonstratives are demonstratives like this and that used to talk about perceptually available objects. So by focusing on these expressions, Campbell draws upon the cognitive science of attention in order to give a detailed account of the nature of sense. So Campbell's account explains his earlier version of Frege's puzzle, which we will review in a moment, and it also refines Evans's notion of keeping track, which we saw in the previous lecture and which I will now review. So again, as a review, let's look at the earlier work of Campbell and Evans. So, as we saw in the previous lecture, Evans argued that the sense of a token indexical or demonstrative is given by an account of a subject's ability to keep track of an object. And this idea of being able to keep track of an object is still kind of schematic. So the question before us should be, in understanding this paper of Campbell's, when we focus on uses of perceptual demonstratives, what more can we say about the nature of this ability to keep track of an object? So how can we refine or give a more detailed account of this notion of sense as involving an ability to keep track of something? So I will also now give a more precise account of what perceptual demonstratives are. So a perceptual demonstrative is a use of a demonstrative this or that in order to think or talk about an object that is perceptually available. Okay, so for example, imagine that we are sitting in a park together on a park bench, and you see someone walking who, for whatever reason, looks suspicious to you. Enemy pointing at the person, you say, "That man looks suspicious." So in your utterance, there is a demonstrative, that man, and you've used it to talk about an object, or this person, this man, who is perceptually available. He is within our perceptual reach in the sense that we can easily look at him and attend to him. So these uses of demonstratives are the ones which Campbell in this current paper is focused on giving an account of sense for. Now, before moving to Campbell's account in this paper, I will review Campbell's way of understanding Frege's puzzle from the earlier paper of his that we read. And this is the idea of being able to trade on identity. So if we recall Campbell's refinement of Frege's puzzle, on this refinement, cognitive value is treated as about which inferences are licensed. So in particular, Campbell argued that perceptual attention to an object licenses inferences that trade on identity, and so are valid without additional identity premises. So let me work through an example, and this example is given by Campbell at the beginning of his the paper for this week. So let me work through this example to illustrate what it means to be able to trade on identity. So suppose you are in a room with two windows, and suppose that there are tree branches visible through each window. These tree branches happen to be branches of the same tree. However, this is not immediately obvious to you. Now, in this situation, the inference here in alpha is valid. So in alpha, what you're doing is when you use these demonstratives to talk about the tree, but in each case you kind of point out the same window. So imagine as a first premise you say that tree, and you point at the left window is large. Then for the second premise you say that tree, and you point out the left window again, is a pine. And so you conclude that that tree is a large pine, and again when you use this final demonstrative, you point out the left window. So this inference seems to be by itself valid. Okay. However, in this situation, the inference in beta does not seem to be valid. So even though it's the same tree, if you make the following inference in this situation, it's not a valid inference. So suppose you point out the left window and you say that tree is large, and then you point out the right window and you say that tree is a pine. Then if you try to conclude that tree is a large pine and point out the left window, it's not a valid inference. It's not immediately obvious that you're talking about the same tree. Because in one case, in the first premise, you're pointing out the one window, and in the second premise, you're pointing out the other window. So in this situation, the inference in alpha seems to be valid, and we're able to group together the information about this one object, i.e. its largeness and its being a pine. We're allowed to group together this information as about the same object without having to appeal to any identity premise. You just say that tree is large, that tree is a pine, so therefore that tree is a large pine. Okay, so you can simply group together that information without adding any additional premise that it's the same tree you're talking about in each case. Okay, and what that means is that in alpha, you're able to trade on the identity of these two things that you're talking about. Whereas in beta, when you're making different demonstrations, you're not able to trade on the identity of the thing demonstrated. So in beta, in order to have a valid argument, you have to add an identity premise, as in gamma. So here we have the same premises and conclusion as beta, but what we do is we add an explicit identity premise. So first I say that tree, and I point out the left window, I say that tree is large, and then pointing out the right window, I say that tree is a pine, and then I say that tree, pointing out the left window, is that tree, pointing out the right window. So I add as a premise explicitly the claim that it's the same tree that's being demonstrated. And when I do that, I can then conclude that this tree is a large pine. So here I've explicitly added an identity premise, okay? Whereas for alpha, this inference is totally valid or justified without adding this identity premise. So in alpha, because it's the same demonstration, I am able to trade on the identity and not have to assert it. So Campbell's account of sense will explain how, in some cases, you can trade on the identity, and in some cases, you won't. I.e., Campbell will give an account of sense which explains the different cognitive value of singular terms or perceptual demonstratives that have the same reference, okay? Because all of these uses of the demonstratives have the same referent, but they have different cognitive values. And so in this paper that we're looking at today, Campbell gives an account of sense that explains cognitive value. As an exercise to test your understanding of this notion of Frege puzzle, what you can do is try to construct a similar contrast in valid inferences based on the situation that Perry describes in his case of the USS Enterprise. And this is found on page 483 of his paper, Frege on Demonstratives, which we read.